Jimin breaks down on live TV after revealing a hidden truth about his father. What he says shocks Jimmy Kimmel and stuns the entire audience. Is your father proud of you? Jimmy Kimmel's voice echoed like a sudden gunshot in a silent cathedral. The studio lights didn't flicker, but it felt like they dimmed. The crowd's laughter from the previous segment still hung in the air like smoke, but the mood had shifted. Instantly, undeniably. Jimin blinked. His lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. His smile, the gentle curve millions adored, trembled just slightly at the edge. One hand moved subconsciously toward his chest, brushing his blazer near the heart. There was a pause, short in seconds, eternal in wait. He began, then stopped. You could hear a pin drop on the polished hardwood stage. The live audience didn't know whether to laugh, stay quiet, or lean in. Jimmy, still holding his cue cards, glanced nervously at his producer off stage. The silence wasn't scripted. Jimin looked up. I wasn't expecting that question, he said, finally, but his voice was hollow, far from the charming tenor that had serenaded arenas worldwide. Then came the blink again, slower, heavier. His fingers curled against his lap. His throat bobbed once, trying to swallow the invisible knot that had been dormant for years, but now clawed its way to the surface. I haven't spoken about my father publicly, he added, his gaze drifting past the cameras, past Jimmy, past the entire studio. He wasn't in LA anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere much more painful. Do you want to skip that one? Jimmy offered, softer now, aware that something real had just cracked through the showbiz surface. But Jimmy didn't answer. He stood up. There was no dramatic slam, no outburst, just the quiet, deliberate sound of a chair sliding back as Jimin rose to his feet, one hand briefly covering his face as his shoulders began to shake, ever so slightly. He walked off the stage. The crowd gasped. Some clapped in confusion, others froze. Jimmy sat still, stunned. Backstage, cameras scrambled. Assistants fumbled with earpieces. Someone called out for water. But Jimin wasn't hearing any of it. He was in a corridor lined with dressing rooms, but in his mind, he was 11 years old again, standing by the door of a modest home in Busan, watching his father pack a suitcase in silence. The door had closed that night with a soft click, but the sound had reverberated for years, echoing through every award speech he'd written but never finished, every diary entry he'd started but torn up, every question he hoped the media would never ask. Until tonight. Jungkook was the first to reach him backstage. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stood next to him, placed one hand on his shoulder, and waited. Jimin didn't cry loud. His tears were the kind that burn the skin, silent, controlled, but vicious. The kind that waited far too long to fall. I thought I could handle it, Jimin whispered. I know, Jungkook replied, voice barely audible. He was never there, but I still hoped maybe he'd see me now. Jungkook's hand tightened slightly. You've done more than enough to be seen, Jimmy. They stood there in silence. Jimmy's show continued without them, awkwardly transitioning into the next segment with jokes that now sounded hollow. But somewhere deeper in the building, in the dressing room lit with soft yellow bulbs and lined with vanity mirrors, something real was happening. Jimin stared at his reflection, his perfectly styled hair, flawless skin, and the eyes that now looked more like his father's than he ever admitted. There was a part of him that hated that, another part that held on to it. He sat down slowly, not in exhaustion, but surrender. Not to the cameras, not to the show, to the truth. For years he had been everyone's source of light, a voice, a dancer, a friend, a star. But tonight he was just a son, one with unanswered letters in his heart. And for the first time in his career, the world saw the boy behind the perfection. He wiped his eyes, slowly, deliberately. Then he stood again. The next time the camera saw him, it was a behind-the-scenes clip released by the show's editor. Not a performance, not a statement, just a quiet shot of Jimmy, walking down the hallway, head held a little lower, but step steady. The clip went viral, not because of the drama, but because every fan who watched it could feel what Jimmy had tried so hard to bury for years: pain, hope, and the ghost of a goodbye that never happened. And this was just the beginning. The morning sun cast long streaks of gold across the Los Angeles skyline, but Jimmy hadn't slept. The hotel room was quiet, too quiet for a man who had spent the past decade hearing fans scream his name in stadiums. He stood barefoot on the balcony, a cup of untouched tea in his hand, watching the city breathe. There was no script today, no schedule, no rehearsals, just a lingering ache in his chest that refused to be swallowed. His phone buzzed with endless notifications, articles, tweets, texts. Headlines screamed in all caps: Jimin breaks down on live TV. BTS star walks out of Jimmy Kimmel's show in tears. Who is Jimin's father, and why has he never spoken about him? Jimin turned the phone over, face down. The questions weren't new. The attention wasn't new. But this feeling, this exposed, stripped-down version of himself, was terrifying. He went to his suitcase and dug beneath the neat folds of clothes until his fingers touched old leather. A notebook, faded black, worn on the edges. The pages inside were filled with scribbled lyrics, unfinished thoughts, and one sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front was his, slightly shaky, uneven. To Appa. He'd written it 5 years ago, on the eve of BTS's world tour kickoff in Seoul. That night he had thought maybe he'd send it. Maybe he'd finally say what needed to be said, but the letter had never been mailed. Instead, it traveled with him from city to city like a ghost he couldn't shake. Now, under the weight of last night's breakdown, the seal felt heavier. He sat on the bed and held it. Then slowly, he began to read the words he once couldn't bear to say aloud. Appa, I don't know if you ever watched my performances. Maybe you changed the channel when my name appeared. Maybe you still tell people I'm not your son. But I still wonder. I still hope. I danced so hard my legs bled. I sang until my throat gave out. I smiled even when I wanted to disappear. I did all that thinking maybe one day you'd see me and say you were proud. But I don't even know what your voice sounds like anymore. Jimin stopped. His hand trembled. A tear fell on the corner of the envelope. He hadn't cried like this since the night his mother told him his father wouldn't be coming back. That night, he'd clutched the edge of his blanket so tight he ripped it. He remembered pretending to be asleep as his mom broke down in the kitchen. Remembered swearing that if he ever made it big, he'd do it without needing that man. And he did. But success couldn't erase absence. He stared out the window again, thinking about Jimmy's question, the way it had cut through every armor he had built, and how Jungkook, without a word, had been the only one who understood. Jungkook had always known. They'd been trainees together. They'd cried in the same practice rooms. He'd seen Jimin wince every Father's Day, had watched him fake smiles during interviews, and now he was the only one Jimin wanted to talk to. A knock came at the door. Jimin wiped his eyes and opened it.
Jungkook stood there, holding 2 coffees. His hoodie was pulled low over his head, and he had his signature messy hair and that same soft, unreadable expression. "You okay?" Jungkook asked. "No," Jimin answered, "but I'm not pretending today." Jungkook nodded once, stepped in and sat on the carpet, cross-legged. No questions, no advice, just presence. Jimin sat beside him. "I read the letter," he whispered. "The one you never sent?" Jimin nodded. Jungkook took a sip of coffee. "Maybe it's time." Jimin looked at him. "Time for what? Closure?" "No," Jungkook said. "Time to stop blaming yourself." Jimin's eyes widened. "I never said—" "You didn't have to." Jungkook set the cup down. "You think if you were more talented, more perfect, more famous, maybe he would have stayed, but that's not on you." Jimin broke again. The words cracked something deeper than before. "How do I move past this, Jungkook?" he asked. "You don't. You carry it, but you choose how." They sat in silence, the kind that says everything. Later that day, the media storm exploded even further. Jimmy Kimmel's team released an official statement expressing concern and apologizing for the emotional impact of the question. The hashtag #ProtectJimin trended worldwide. But none of it mattered to Jimin, because for the first time in his life, he stopped trying to explain himself to the world. Instead, he wrote a new letter, not to his father, but to himself. You survived. You endured. You loved yourself enough to walk away from the pain, even if it was on national television. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you free. He folded the page and placed it in the same notebook. Tomorrow, he would return to the stage. He'd smile again. He'd dance again. But tonight, he just allowed himself to be human. And for Jimin, that was the bravest thing he had ever done. The morning after his emotional walk-off still lingered in the air like the fog hanging over Los Angeles. But Jimin wasn't hiding anymore. He sat by the hotel window, bathed in warm daylight, phone in hand, thumb hovering over a contact he hadn't dared to tap in over a decade.
Unknown number. No name, no photo, just a thread of text messages that ended 13 years ago. The last message he ever received was one sentence. "You'll understand one day." Jimin never replied. He told himself it was deleted, but he had lied. It stayed buried in a hidden folder, like a wound scabbed over but never healed. Now, with the world watching his every move and his own heart aching for meaning, his finger hovered, then tapped. The screen blinked open. He didn't type anything, but he stared. Then, suddenly, without warning, the phone vibrated. Unknown number. Calling. His heart skipped. He dropped the phone onto the bed like it was burning him. Jungkook, half asleep on the other side of the room, opened one eye. "You okay?" Jimin didn't answer. He just stared at the screen as the phone continued to ring and ring until the call stopped. No voicemail. He picked it up again. His breath was unsteady. Could it be? He redialed once, twice, then hung up before it could ring fully. And then his phone buzzed again. This time, a message. "I saw the show. I'm sorry." Jimin froze. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched. His father had never apologized. Not when he walked out, not when Jimin debuted, not when the headlines filled with his name and legacy. But now, after a single breakdown on late-night TV, he sends that? Jimin's thumbs trembled. He typed, "Why now?" No reply. Then finally, "Because I was too much like my own father, and I was ashamed. I didn't want to fail you the same way he failed me." Jimin read it again and again. The words blurred, not from confusion, but tears. Was this what he had waited for? A confession laced with inherited guilt? He stood, pacing the room, his bare feet quiet on the carpet. His hands moved to his face. Part of him wanted to scream. Another part wanted to fly to Busan and demand more, demand everything that had been taken from him. But he didn't. Instead, he walked into the bathroom, stared at himself in the mirror, and asked a question he hadn't dared speak aloud since he was a boy. Do I forgive him? His reflection didn't answer. Outside the hotel, cameras swarmed, reporters speculated, fans camped out holding signs that read, "We love you, Jimin," and "Family doesn't always mean blood." Inside, he stood perfectly still, battling wars the world couldn't see. Later that afternoon, he went to rehearse. Yes, rehearse, because that's what Jimin did. No matter what chaos stormed inside him, he danced through it. The studio was private, secured, no outsiders. Just Jungkook, a producer, and one of the backup dancers who had worked with him for years. The mirrors reflected a different version of him today. Not broken, but rebuilding. The music began. Jimin moved like silk at war with fire. Every step, every turn, every breath was more than choreography. It was exorcism. Until the final note faded and he collapsed to his knees, not from exhaustion, but from release. He stayed down, hands to the floor, head bowed. "I need to perform again," he said, voice shaky, but sure. Jungkook looked at him from across the room. "We never stopped." Jimin looked up, but before he could smile, another phone buzz echoed. This time, it wasn't his. Jungkook checked his screen. He frowned, then looked at Jimin. "It's from Hybe." Jimin's heart sank. What now? Jungkook handed over the phone. An internal email leaked. It was already spreading across forums. The subject line read, "Damage control strategy. Jimin's public breakdown." Jimin's stomach turned. He read the contents. A media strategy, framing his moment as a courageous vulnerability, suggesting selective interviews, even proposing a documentary angle. They weren't asking how he felt. They were turning it into content. He let the phone fall onto the floor. So this was how his pain was valued. Pixels, PR, and spin. Jimin stood in the center of the room, eyes locked with Jungkook. "I don't want my breakdown turned into a brand." "I'll help stop it," Jungkook said, without hesitation. "You'll get in trouble. I don't care." Jimin inhaled slowly, chest heaving. That night, instead of hiding, he went live on his own platform. No makeup, no studio lighting, just him and the world. "I want to speak without filters tonight. No handlers, no PR, just me." He told the story, the truth, about the father who left, the silence that followed, the letter he never sent, and the phone call that shattered every illusion he built. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't cry. He just spoke. Quietly, honestly, and over 18 million people tuned in. The comment section exploded. Fans cried, parents apologized to their children, strangers confessed their own wounds. Because Jimin wasn't just telling his story, he was telling theirs. When he signed off, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. That night, he slept. Truly slept. No nightmares, no guilt. Just dreams of a stage lit with gold, not judgment. And for the first time in years, he woke up without a weight on his chest. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally let it breathe. The stage was massive. Lights like stars pulsed above thousands of fans who held their breath as Jimin walked forward, alone. No backup dancers, no distractions, just him in an all-black ensemble. Simple, clean, stripped of theatrics. The silence before the first note felt sacred, as though the entire world leaned in, waiting for the moment. Then the screen behind him lit up, not with his face, but with words. "I never needed you to come back. I just needed you to say goodbye." The crowd went silent. Some gasped, others cried. The opening piano notes played, soft, raw, almost unfinished. A new song, one no one had heard before. He had written it in secret, not for the charts, not for the label, but for himself. As he sang, his voice trembled, not from nerves, but because every lyric carried weight. Every syllable was soaked in truth. The song wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about begging for love, it was about letting go. Behind the scenes, Jungkook watched from the side of the stage, his hands clenched at his sides. He knew what this moment meant, knew how long it had taken Jimin to get here, not just physically, but emotionally. After the song ended, the lights dimmed, the audience erupted. Jimin stood still, looking out across a sea of faces, young, old, weeping, smiling. He bowed deeply, not just for them, for the journey. And then he did something unexpected. He walked back to the mic and spoke. "I used to believe that pain made me stronger," he began, voice calm, measured. "But I've learned that healing is what makes us powerful." He looked straight into the nearest camera. "To the person who left me behind when I was too young to understand, I forgive you, but I didn't owe you that. I owed it to myself." Backstage, the Hybe executive sat in stunned silence. The PR team had drafted 3 versions of a pre-approved speech. Jimin had ignored them all. And the world loved him more for it. That same night, the news cycle exploded again, but differently. This wasn't about scandal or drama. It was about closure. Jimin brings stadium to tears with new song about father's abandonment. Fans applaud Jimin's bold live confession. He chose peace over pain. BTS member teaches the world what true healing looks like. In the days that followed, his fan mail quadrupled, not with posters or merch, but with stories. Letters from children of divorced homes, messages from those raised without a parent, notes from fans who had waited years to forgive someone who never asked for it. Jimin didn't respond to all of them. He couldn't, but he read every single one. Because now he understood. He was never alone in his silence. A week later, Jimin flew to Busan. He didn't tell the media, didn't bring security. Just a hoodie, a journal, and one thing he never thought he'd carry again. The original letter. The one he wrote 5 years ago. He didn't plan to deliver it, but he needed to stand in front of the house where it all started. The old neighborhood hadn't changed much. Faded walls, rusted gates, the same convenience store where he used to buy milk with coins. He stopped at the house. A light was on. He didn't knock. He didn't want a reunion. He just wanted peace. He slid the envelope into the mailbox, looked up at the sky, and, for the first time, didn't ask why. He just whispered, "Thank you for leaving," then turned away, not out of bitterness, but because he no longer needed answers to heal. On the flight back to Seoul, he wrote in his journal, "You don't need the person who hurt you to say they're sorry. Sometimes healing is an act of rebellion. Sometimes it's a love letter to yourself." Back home, he returned to the studio, released his song as a surprise track. No promo, no teaser, just titled, "No Goodbye Needed." It charted globally within hours, but Jimin didn't check the numbers. He was outside, walking barefoot on the grass behind Hybe's training building, breathing deep, smiling at the sky. He had finally found the one thing fame could never buy: closure. And he did it on his own terms.